Okay, where to start when you have a ball of yarn? First off, a ball of yarn is called a skein of yarn, and most of them come where they are wound with one piece of the yarn that winds from the outside and one piece of yarn that's going to come from the inside. You can see that that's coming from the inside. If I open up this ball of yarn and pull, this is going to come from the inside. That's for a couple reasons. Some people prefer working with two strings of yarn, and therefore if you're working, one will continuously come from the inside and one will come from the outside and work its way in. Some people prefer to work with the yarn from the inside because then when you're pulling for more yarn, your ball kind of stays in place. If you pull from the outside, the ball will kind of flop around like this. Some people don't like working with the yarn from the inside because some skeins, depending on the manufacturer, tend to get knotted up into little balls, which is true, but it just depends on you and when you're starting to work with your skein of yarn. Once you've determined what size crochet hook you want for your skein of yarn, you can start working. And I'm going to make this video for people who are starting crochet for the very first time and maybe don't necessarily know where to start or how to even hold the hook. So hooks come in different materials. This one is aluminum. You can hear it's metal. It has a little flat piece right here that's easy for holding with your thumb. This side is the hook side. It's a little bit pointed so that sometimes when you're having to work your way through a stitch, you can do it with that. The hook obviously grabs the yarn, and that's the end. The size is written on the hook. For instance, this one is a size I or 9, which is a 5.5 millimeter. You'll find this used in different forms of knitting. For instance, if you're doing American knitting or English knitting or French knitting or crochet, the size sometimes varies. So sometimes it'll say an I, sometimes it'll say a 9, sometimes it'll say the millimeters. So that's all that means. When you're starting from the very beginning, you just have your tail of yarn and you have your crochet hook. I hold my hook like this with my thumb loose and support it with my index finger. That way when you come together, your thumb can come right where that little flat notch is, but to each their own, however it's comfortable. I'm also using the base of my hand right here as kind of a support, so I can create a little tension when I wrap my fingers around. When you start crochet, you start with a slip knot. So that's just taking 2 fingers on my opposite hand, wrapping the yarn around and bringing it through. Just a basic slip knot, and as you pull it, it gets tight. That's where you're going to start crocheting. You put your hook into the slip knot. One side's a little tail, one side is your working yarn, which is coming from the skein. And to get that ready, you're just going to pull it tight so it comes onto your hook, just like that. To get started, you're going to do what's called a foundation chain or start chaining. In your working hand, for me, I'm right-handed, I'm going to hold the hook and also that little tail of yarn because that's just scrap yarn. That's not going to be in my finished piece. This is the knot that's on your hook. This is your working yarn. In my left hand, I'm going to create almost like a spindle or a little tension for my working yarn. And for me, I tend to hold one finger up. Different people do it differently. But that's creating a little work right here, not so much slack. So to get started, you're going to create some tension and you're going to create little loops. You're going to take the working yarn and pull it through this slip knot. If you can see, that's created a little V. That's actually your first little stitch. That's your first chain. A chain is just what it's doing. It's making a chain. You're going to take your working yarn and pull it through. Come behind the working yarn, grab it with the hook, and pull it through. I'm holding this very lightly, and I'm holding this part right here between my thumb and forefinger of the yarn a little more firmly. I'm holding that firmly because I don't want to drop it. I'm holding this loosely because I don't want my chains right here to be too tight. This finger is actually holding up the tension or the working yarn. That's where I can grab from like a spindle. So I'm pulling through, I'm pulling through, I'm pulling through, I'm pulling through, and so on. That's creating what we call a chain. This is going to be your chain. Now I've just chained a couple here, and what you're going to do is count how many you've chained. So I think it's pretty self-explanatory to see. Each little V is a different chain. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. This would be 8, So I have 8 chains here. Your project is going to tell you to start with a foundation chain of so many. For instance, if you're making a sweater, you might have a foundation chain of 125. So you would do this 125 times. If you're going to make a magic circle, you might have a chain of 3 or of 5. So I would delete it by basically doing this. You just simply pull them out if I needed to have 3. And then you could easily add them back in if you maybe miscounted or messed one up. So chaining is very simple, but that's going to be the very foundation of any work that you do. So I'm going to chain a few here, and that's going to give me a long little string. That's going to be my chain. And from here, that's where your stitches go into. Taking this little pointed side of the crochet hook, your stitches are going to start into that chain and work their way back around. For instance, if your piece said chain 15 and work a single crochet into the second chain from the hook, well, what does that mean? You would look right here. This is the hook. These are the chains. So my second chain from hook, I would just count. This is the first one. This is the second one. See those little holes? You're counting those holes basically. So if I'm going to single crochet into the second chain from hook, I'm going to skip the first one, which is right here, and I'm going to go into the second one, and I'm going to pull the working yarn through. I now have 2 strands on my crochet hook. All I did was simply pull that through the hole. I'm still holding tension here with this finger, and I'm going to grab that working yarn again and pull it through those 2 loops that I have on the hook. That has essentially created my first stitch. To do that again, if I'm continuing across, again, here's my chains. I'm going to tighten this and hold it the way I feel comfortable. I'm going to take my crochet hook into the next chain, pushing it through. I grab the working yarn, pull it through the loop. I again have 2 loops on my hook, and I'm going to pull that working yarn through both. This is what you're going to continue doing. You can kind of use any finger. I use my index finger to kind of hold that in place and help the stitch along until you get comfortable holding the crochet hook in your hand. Okay, you can kind of play around with what you're going to do. This is single crochet. If I take this out, you can see I have my chain, which I started with. I have my little tail of yarn. This is my working yarn. This is where my crochet hook is going. And these are those little single crochets I just created.